Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mist, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. Today we're going to be talking about a quite controversial subject, as I'm going to explain in a minute. This is the third of my 3 videos I've called my Controversial 3. That's a play on the Ladies 3, the Fanes of Barovia, quite a popular mod to Curse of Strahd. My first 2 videos were, the first one was about being careful if you increase the map size of Barovia. That is by far my most popular video to date. I think a lot of people understood that the advice was good, but there were some people who disagreed, and that's fine. Like I said, controversial. My second Controversial 3 video was the best time and place to introduce Strahd in a campaign, where I said that most people, and this is backed up with a poll, this is not just anecdotal or me just saying this, most people introduce him at Collion's funeral in the village of Barovia, and I said, well, that is a good spot to introduce him. There's one that I think is better. I'm kind of sad that that wasn't as popular as I expected. As I record this, it's had about 200 views, bearing in mind the map size one is over 4,000, I believe. I haven't checked it for a little while. So I was really hoping it would be similar to the map size one. Maybe it's the thumbnail, maybe it's the topic, maybe it's the title. I can overanalyze this stuff. But if you haven't seen it already, please check it out. Especially if you're like, no, Collion's funeral is the best place. Don't say otherwise. And I'm excited but nervous about this video in particular, because in this video, I'm going against what over 50% of Curse of Strahd DMs say you should do. And this, again, isn't me just saying this. I did a poll in the Curse of Strahd DMs Facebook group a couple of years ago now, admittedly, where I asked people, how did you do the Tarokka reading? And over 50% of people, more than half, said they rigged it. They stacked the deck. So yeah, I'm going to be saying very soon why you shouldn't do that. But you shouldn't run it random as the book tells you to either. I've landed on what I think is a nice in-between solution where you can have it random to an extent, but also very heavily controlled, that's almost close to stacking it, but without stacking it. Before I continue, I want to be really upfront about something. I do have a DM's Guild resource that can help with this in-between process. I want to make it clear up front because I know people hate being sold to, I hate being sold to, and I don't want this video to look like a giant advert for this product. Technically it kind of sort of is, but yeah, so I want to make it clear now because I want to talk through the Tarokka reading, pros and cons of random, pros and cons of stacked, and then be like, oh, it just so happens I've got this product on the DM's Guild that can help you. So I want to be really upfront with it because I know people don't like that kind of thing. So yes, I will be talking about a DM's Guild product later on that can help with the process. Buy it if you want, don't buy it if you don't want. I think for $2 less if you get it in a sale, it does just save you a bit of work, and I think there's more to it than that, but you could, do this whole thing without buying it, and that's fine. But, you might want to check it out, so I am going to talk about that more later. Let's do a quick overview of the Tarokka reading. I'm assuming people watching this video know Curse of Strahd and know what the Tarokka reading entails, but just in case someone's watching this who haven't even bought or picked up and read through the book, there is a tarot card reading in-game in universes called Tarokka. A Tarokka reading that kind of guides the players to important items. Some of them are magic weapons, some of them are like contain information that are scattered throughout the whole of the map of Barovia. There are 40 possible places for 3 items could end up in, and there's 14 separate cards you use to push people towards a fated ally, or Strahd's enemy is the correct terminology, but fated ally is what a lot of people say. Someone who will help the players, the player characters fight Strahd, and Strahd's location in Castle Ravenloft, where they should look for him if they want, when it comes to the time for the final showdown. I think it's amazing. I think the idea of a Tarokka reading is incredible. I did see one person once call it a gimmick, and that was one of those moments where if I'd been there in person, I think it was a Reddit comment, if I'd been there in person, I'd be like, hold me back, because, I mean, them's fighting words. Like, how dare you refer to the Tarokka reading as a gimmick is all I'm going to say. It's cool, it's clever, it randomizes play, it's really unique, and I love it, and I will defend it to the death. There's probably more important things I should defend it to the death, but you get what I mean. And yeah, the tricky thing is the Tarokka reading, if you do it straight out of the book, is fully random. These items, important items, can end up in different places. 2 of them can really good at helping the players defeat Strahd, obviously the campaign's villain. But it's it's up to the randomness of the cards. You could end up in a situation where they're all spread out in a nice way, and it leads to a satisfying campaign where they're all spread out nicely and the really important items are in really tough places and stuff like that. But there is the risk that the Tome of Strahd, which is information about Strahd that can be used against him, is found really late on in the campaign. That's ideally something they want found early. Or the Sun Sword is either right outside Madame Eva's tent, she's the one who gives the card reading, or literally down the road at the crossroads, River Evelys crossroads, if I remember off the top of my head, it's not in my notes, that, as soon as they leave Sir Pool Encampment after the card reading, they find the Sun Sword, the essentially sunlight lightsaber, straight away. And that, at level 3, that's ideally something you'd want them getting until level 8, 9 when they're ready to take down Strahd. That was going to make the game a lot easier for them. The ally choice as well could be, some of the ally choices are great, some of them you could argue are probably a bit too overpowered, thinking of someone like Godfrey. Some of them are not so much. You've got Donovich, who I think is less than 10 HP, and one of them is literally a child. But I do like the idea of a random draw from the book as it's intended. It's unique for a role-playing game, as I mentioned earlier. It randomizes play. The player's going to think, wow, our experience is going to be completely different to every other table out there. Someone did the maths of the possibility once. I should have researched this before doing this video, but I'm sure someone did the maths once of the possibility of all the different outcomes, and it's in the millions, I think. Millions of chance of getting the same draw as somebody else. And I think it's exciting. It's exciting for the players. I think it's exciting for DMs as well. I find it exciting thinking, where's everything going to end up? Where are my players? Where's this campaign going to go? I know there are some DMs who probably would feel more comfortable if they had a good idea of where the campaign is steered, and therefore stacking the deck, rigging the deck helps with that significantly. There are other downsides to doing the Tarokka reading as the book intends, doing it random. So I've already mentioned about items can end up in places that aren't ideal, get the Sun Sword early, the Tome late, a bad fit ally or no ally at all. You might end up getting a location you weren't hoping to include. This actually happened to me. I didn't necessarily want to include the Werewolf Den, but one of the items ended up there. So I was like, well, I guess I gotta include the Werewolf Den now. Or you might end up not getting a location you were hoping to include, and this also happened to me. I really wanted to include Argynvost but didn't end up getting Argynvost in the draw, so I had to think of other ways to usher the players to Argynvost if I was going to get them to go there and include that in my campaign. In the end, when I ran it in my game, I didn't do random. I didn't do it as the book tells you. I did what I call semi-random. I know of quite a few DMs who do this. This is essentially removing cards from the Tarokka deck and going random from there. So I removed outside Madame Eva's tent, down the road, anything that involved backtracking, and all of the items from Castle Ravenloft. I think this was a Mandy mod suggestion. I think when I read her guides, I came across this. So kudos to her if that's true. If it's not, apologies. And I ended up with a pretty decent draw. I ended up with the Tome in the Wokta House in Vallaki, the symbol, the Holy Symbol of Ravenkind in the Abbey at Kresk, and the Sun Sword in the Werewolf Den. But admittedly, I got very lucky because I still could have had all 3 items in Vallaki, for example, and that wouldn't have been great. There's a lot of people who say the problem with random is you could end up with all 3 items in Castle Ravenloft, and that's true. And, with Castle Ravenloft, the players can potentially go there multiple times through the story, could even potentially do a heist at one point to get Argynvost's skull. But yeah, most people kind of see it as an end game dungeon. To get items there is a bit harsh and unfair. It's almost like, will the players realistically be able to obtain them before the fight with Strahd? So yeah, the fact that I could have gotten 3 in Vallaki is also not ideal. But there's one point I really want to say when I did the Tarokka reading semi-random, which was I was shuffling the cards in front of my players. We played over Roll20 in Zoom for the video, and I had a top-down camera which I used like a mic stand and the sort of thing that goes on a ring light to attach the phone. And then I was one of the screens as well. And I was shuffling the cards in front of them and always in shot of the camera. And I said something like, you can see there's no tricks here. There's no rigging the cards. This is all decided by fate. So they could see that I didn't, I shuffled the cards and literally laid out the cards and we went from there. So they knew there was no any element of stacking or rigging. I made sure as well I didn't put the cards out of the shot or anything like that. So they might think, okay, he's put it out of the shot. You could have changed the cards then. One of my players afterwards told me it was his highlight of 2020. So I started DMing in April 2020, not long after COVID and lockdown. That was a weird year, wasn't it? But we'd finished Lost Mine of Fandalva and started Curse of Strahd just in time for Halloween. I did the card reading, I think it was like early November 2020, so about 4 years ago as I record this. And my player said it was the highlight of his 2020. And not just his D&D highlight, his highlight full stop. He was blown away by the card reading. He's blown away by the randomness of it, the idea of it, the fact that the items could be anywhere. Although, yes, technically I did tweak it slightly by not including certain cards. And that was amazing. That's such a cool thing that he was that moved and blown away by the card reading and the fact that the card reading was obviously random. And it's important that I mention this because when I talk later about rigging it and stacking it and the downsides of rigging and stacking it, I'm going to probably come back to this anecdote if I remember. Let's next talk about stacking the deck. So stacking the deck is literally rigging it so the cards you want appear as the cards that are drawn. And people do this because they want to avoid the randomness, the risk of items and ending up in bad places. And they want to usher the characters to certain locations. Say if you really want to run Argynvost, we'll put the tome or the holy symbol or the sun sword there, guarantees it near enough. And there's numerous ways people stack the deck. So they might already have the cards laid out ahead of the session. So your players arrive, whether it's in person or online, and they see the cards are already there. So you don't have to worry about shuffling them and that. And your players might think, oh, you shuffled it and did it all beforehand, even if you didn't. The cards could already be shuffled, but then your cards you want already at the top. There is a risk to this. I remember reading an anecdote somewhere where a player, they saw the cards, picked them up, shuffled them, put them back, and the DM freaked out because the DM had already laid it out so that the cards they wanted were at the top. Now there's an argument there of, well, the player shouldn't just picked up the DM's stuff and started messing around with it. But I think there is the argument there that players, if they see a pack of cards, they assume randomness. They're not going to assume that you're stacking or rigging the deck. What I think a lot of DMs do is they shuffle the cards in front of the players. So they're like, this is random. And then what they do is, before they carry on, is they put the card deck behind the DM screen, or in my case, playing online, they might put it to the side of the screen. They then put the cards they want on top, which weren't part of the pack of cards when they were being shuffled. And then they do the card reading visible in front of everyone, so it looks as though the cards were shuffled, and then hey presto, those are the cards that you actually wanted. And I've even heard stories of people doing actual card tricks and sleight of hand things like magicians or people who cheat at cards do, I guess, and that does sound cool. I'd be worried about screwing it up, to be honest with you, and just dropping the cards everywhere or something like that, or the card drops out of my sleeve, or however they do it. Now, there are obvious pros to stacking the deck versus running at random. The obvious thing, as I've said earlier, is you can have full control over where things end up. You want one of the items in a certain location, you can do that. And you can usher players to the locations you want to run. The downsides are, in addition to the fact that you lose the randomness and the chaos, and I would argue excitement of doing it random, is it just doesn't sit well with me deceiving your players. It is essentially deceiving your players in a way. Unless there are some DMs who would be upfront and say, listen, I'm going to stack the reading, or they might not say it as explicitly as that and say something like, right, I'm going to try and control the story to make it more satisfying for you. And yeah, but there are also some DMs who literally rig the Tarokka reading, but give the illusion that it is 100% random. And I don't know, it doesn't sit well with me. I don't like doing that for a number of reasons I'm going to get to now. The fact of the matter is, what if they find out that you've stacked the deck? What if you make a mistake when you draw the cards and, it becomes obvious to them? That anecdote I mentioned a minute ago, where a player picked up the DM's cards, shuffled them, put them back. The DM's reaction, if they freaked out or looked really concerned, might have given the game away. What if you're doing a sleight of hand card trick and you make a mistake? What if when you put the cards, after you shuffle them, put them behind the DM screen, add your cards, the players are looking and going, yeah, we didn't see the cards the whole time, you could have done something there. Yeah, things like that could happen, but there's other ways they might be able to find out, or at least suspect, even if it goes really smoothly on the night. They could hear about it from other Curse of Strahd DMs and players, that, how did your DM do the card reading? Did they rig it? Did they do it random? And then if you think, actually I didn't see the cards the whole time, you might think maybe it wasn't random after all. They might want to DM Curse of Strahd for themselves. That's what I did. I was a player in Curse of Strahd, and then I wanted to DM for other people. And when I researched it, I saw on places like the Curse of Strahd subreddit that a lot of people like to rig it. So if I might have then thought, did my DM rig it for me? And that kind of thing. In my case, as I mentioned earlier, I shuffled in front of the camera, the Zoom camera, and shuffled, and that pack of cards didn't leave sight of that camera, and then I laid them out from there, so there was no doubt. But if you ran Curse of Strahd, or you're going to run Curse of Strahd, and you don't do something like that, there may always be that sort of lingering doubt of, did my DM rig the Tarokka reading? And of course, there may, there's arguments. I remember starting a thread on the Curse of Strahd subreddit where I asked people their experiences. Did your players ever find out what happened? What did they say? And I remembered, I think one of the top comments was somebody saying, my players trust me to run a game that's satisfying narratively. And you know what? That's fine. That's fair enough. And that's the whole reason people rig the Tarokka reading, is because they want to make sure it's a satisfying story. It's not going to be a satisfying story if they get the Sunsword really early or the Tome really late. But again, doesn't sit well with me. That's my own personal opinion, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who disagree with me or tell me it doesn't matter or what have you. Let me know in the comments, obviously. Now is the time I'm going to tell you about an in-between solution I landed on. First things first, I didn't come up with this idea originally. I saw somebody on Reddit, I think it was, float the idea, where they basically said, what I did with the items is I split them into 3 piles, 1 pack of cards, 1 small pack of cards for each item, rather than having 1 big pack of cards with up to 40 cards for all 3. But that person just said that, as far as I remember, that person just said that and didn't actually go to the effort of saying, well, I would choose these cards for this pile, the Tome pile, these cards for the Sunsword pile, and these cards for the Symbol pile, for example. So I decided to put on DM's Guild what I call the 3-pile Tarokka technique, and it essentially tells you how to split the cards, which cards to remove, which cards belong in which piles, and so on. Yes, technically, the whole business I was saying a minute ago about how, if your players then research Curse of Strahd afterwards because they want to run it for themselves, they'll realise that you've done it slightly different, but you are doing it random to an extent. It's almost like what I would call controlled random, but still very satisfying. It leads to what I would call like a more ideal spread. There's 2 important points to think about with Curse of Strahd. One is, it is a sandbox, but it's quite linear initially if you're running it as per the book, where they arrive, village of Barovia, escort Irina to Vallaki, and then from there it opens up. But it's linear to begin with, and they'll have the card reading, or they should have the card reading on the way to Vallaki in the first place. The other point as well is, I think many CoS DMs will agree with me saying that the ideal spread of the items is that the Tome of Strahd is received early. That's the information about Strahd. The Holy Symbol of Ravenkind is received sort of mid-game-ish, is a good place to sort of pick that up. That does do sunlight, but there's a few other things. And then the Sunsword, the ultimate vampire killing weapon, and, Strahd's Bane, if you will, is found somewhere sort of end game, later on in the game. So what I do in the 3-pile Tarokka technique is first of all, I explain which cards to remove. And it's a bit like I said with the whole semi-random control random thing I did earlier. Remove the castle cards, remove Madame Eva's tent, and I think 1 or 2 others. You then split the remaining cards into 3 piles. I'm not going to go into in-depth detail about which cards and how in this video. There is, obviously you can pick up the guide on DM's Guild, or there's another video I did where it was kind of like a demo video where I do 2 like example draws, and you can kind of get a rough idea from there. But to give you a rough idea, the Tome is likely to appear in places like the Old Bone Grinder, that's the Windmill with the Hags, Vallaki, or the Winery. That's early-ish game. Early game is probably Village of Barovia, but you get what I mean. It's kind of after that and when the campaign opens up. It's those kinds of places. The Holy Symbol of Ravenkind will be kind of mid-game-ish. Again, thinking of the table near the start of Curse of Strahd that kind of tells you what levels characters should be. The ones that are kind of like level 6, 7, 8 are places like Krezg, Argynvostholt, and a few others. And then the Sunsword should be end game stuff. We're talking Berez and the Amber Temple, places that if the characters aren't already level 8 or 9, it's dangerous to go there. And what it also means and does is that it spreads the cards out. You aren't going to risk having 3 items or even 2 items in Vallaki because they're all spread out. And so there's 3 places that the characters may go to that they may not have gone to otherwise because of this card reading directing them to it. The guide, because I understand that there'll be people who say, for example, let's say you really want to include Argynvostholt, and if you're going to rig the deck, you were going to include it as one of the 3 item locations. But instead you use my guide, 3-pile Tarokka technique, and you don't get Argynvostholt. What I've done as well, just to kind of make things easy, is for all the places sort of post-Vallaki, I have a list of hooks. Most of them from the book, it'll be things like, this character wants to go there, or the gossip of Barovians in general, or gossip or knowledge of Valachians or Krasgites in Krasg will guide you to these places. Or the random, say for example, with Argynvost or the random encounter with the Revenant on the road, you can make it a random encounter instead of a random encounter, if you get me. You can kind of just place it there. And it references, the Curse of Strahd book tells you what page numbers you can find this information, just to make life a bit easier. So if you do the 3-piled Tarokka technique, you wanted Argynvost, you don't get Argynvost as your location for, I think it's the symbol for the Argynvost cards, you can still include it in your game with my help with that information. I also include an appendix where it's all the cards laid out, you know, all the stars cards, all the glyph cards, all the whatever the other ones are called, and shows you this one's removed, this one is for Argynvost, this one's for the Amber Temple, and so on and so on, and what items they're for as well. So as I mentioned, if you want to see it in action, there's a demo video I did a few months ago when I first put out the product that shows, I did the draw twice. So I do an example draw and I'm like, hey, for fun, let me do it again, and you can see. I'm hoping there's DMs who watch it who'll agree with me that what you see is quite a satisfying spread, and it leads the players to good places and makes sense campaign-wise or story-wise where they all end up. And that's it for that one. So my controversial view, disagreeing with over 50% of Curse of Strahd DMs, saying don't rate the Tarokka reading, but don't run it random either. I'd love to know your thoughts. I'd love to know, when you did the Tarokka reading, how did it go? Did you do it random? Did you do it stacked? Did your other players ever find out that you did stack it if you stacked it? Did you do semi-random like I did, where you just remove some cards? Heck, if you do the 3-pile Tarokka technique, I would love to know what draw you got, and even if you're not playing Curse of Strahd at the moment or running it, even if you've already done the draw, I'd love to know DMs, give it a try, and what draw you get. Leave some comments below and we can chat about that. That'd be great. Upcoming videos on the Curse of Strahd front, I really want to do music of Curse of Strahd, and I want to talk about battle tactics for Strahd depending on where he is in the castle. I also do Ravenloft videos as well for anyone who's thinking of doing Ravenloft one-shots or a campaign, whether it's a sequel for Curse of Strahd like I did, or just something else. So I recently put out my Forlorn video. Forlorn was the second ever Domain of Dread after Barovia. I've done about half a dozen, maybe more, different domains, places like Volkovnia. I did the 5th edition Zombie Siege version, Valachan. Gosh, I'm drawing a blank, what else? Demonliu, the Sea of Sorrows, and a few more. And I can't think of what else I've got coming up for Ravenloft. I think I want to do a good NPCs video, because I did like a minor villains one. I'd like to do one like good NPCs you can introduce that aren't mentioned in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. That's the 5th edition source book setting book for Ravenloft. That's mostly talked about in old novels, old lore from like the 90s, you know, pre-5e. And we'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Wanderers.